It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to Jewish National Fund's first edition in the fall reading series featuring Akiva Gersh and hosted by Steven Shalowitz to discuss Becoming Israeli, the hysterical, inspiring, and challenging sides of making Aliyah. For those of you who are new to Jewish National Fund USA, you probably know of our work planting trees and making the desert bloom. But we do so much more. We build medical facilities, housing infrastructure, parks, schools, and help people with disabilities. We also support economic development initiatives that pave the way for hundreds of thousands of Israelis to move from the crowded center of the country to the Negev and Galilee. The format of today's Zoom program will allow participants to see the featured speakers as well as other participants. All participants are muted and are unable to unmute themselves. However, during the program, you can submit questions to Steven and Akiva through the chat feature. Steven will also be fielding questions throughout the interview. You can switch your view to speaker view, a button located at the upper right-hand corner, which will show the speaker talking in a larger view of your screen and minimize the squares of the other participants. This program will be recorded. I turn the program over to Sarah Cohen, Director of Jewish National Fund's Speakers Bureau.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining this evening to discuss compelling and challenging stories of Aliyah. It's an honor to first introduce Steven Shalowitz. Steven is the host of Jewish National Fund's Israelcast podcast, and for more than 8 years, he's produced and hosted the 𝘊𝘢 Ticket Show podcast, where he explores with fascinating people where they go if given a one-way ticket, no coming back, past, present, or future, real or imaginary. He's also a JNF New York board member and on JNF social media committee, and invites you to connect with him all on social media. His handle is @Steven Shalowitz. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce you to a man who's worked in the field of Jewish and Israel education for 20 years, 13 of which he spent as a Jewish history and Israel studies teacher at Alexander Muss High School in Israel. He is also a contributing blogger at the Times of Israel, as well as a musician. He created Holy Land Spirit in 2010, an uplifting and spiritual musical experience for Christian groups visiting Israel that foster interfaith celebration, understanding, and dialogue. In 2017, he published his first book, The Reason That We're All Here Today, Becoming Israeli, a compilation of blogs and essays about the experience of making Aliyah and acclimating to life in Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, with a really warm welcome for both Steven and Akiva. Thank you all for doing this. Thank you all for joining tonight, and thank you to Steven and Akiva. Take it away.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah. And Akiva, it's fabulous to speak with you again. And we want to share with our listeners that you were actually our guest in episode 33 of Israelcast. So certainly everyone here in the group can go to jnf.org/Israelcast and then check out episode 33. And just a matter of housekeeping for you, Akiva, and for all of the other wonderful folks that are joining us this evening. I have actually two devices here. I'm looking on my phone right now so I can see you, Akiva, and to see everybody else. But also I have my laptop here. So if I'm looking down, you'll understand that I'm looking at the chat because the questions are going to be fielded via Sarah. So anytime I'm looking down here, it means I'm looking at the questions. And that's about it. One other housekeeping point, though, that I do want to share is that we're going to go till about 8:35 or so Eastern time. So for about 35 minutes. And then Akiva has been very kind to stay kind of after school, if you will. It's 3 o'clock in the morning in Israel. And Akiva, I understand that you usually stay up till about 2 o'clock. So this is actually just about an hour past your bedtime, right?
Exactly. So, I woke up an hour later, going to sleep an hour later, so it's all good.
All right. So we appreciate that. Hopefully you're well caffeinated for this. You got your caffeine pumping. Okay. Listen, there's so many bases that I want to cover with you about your book. And again, I loved it, Becoming Israeli. It's not only you writing in the book, but it's also essays. You have guest writers, that have written chapters in the book. And before we really dive into the book, Akiva, can you just share your own Aliyah story? Because one of the things that I think is so interesting about you is that you weren't one of these high school kids that went, or college kids that went on birthright, for example. You really came to the Israel game relatively late, I would say.
Yes. So first of all, I just want to say it's a pleasure and an honor to be on the program tonight, and especially speaking with you, Steven. It's really great to speak with you again. And to make a long story relatively short, so growing up, I had literally no connection to Israel whatsoever. I had, I would call it, a light connection to Judaism growing up in the suburbs of New York City. And, went to public school, went to Hebrew school a couple of times a week. And by the time I got to high school, whatever Jewish connection I had wasn't really interesting to me. And I really kind of dropped that also. So I entered college with very little to no connection Jewishly, no connection to Israel. And then in college, as sometimes happens to people, I started to get more interested in spirituality and searching for more spirituality. That's a whole story in and of itself, not for this program. Maybe
that's our next interview
one day.
Yes,
exactly. It's actually a book I started before I started this book, but I put that on hold for a long time anyway. But within that spiritual search, that spiritual journey, Israel popped up. And as I got, eventually in that spiritual journey, I rediscovered Judaism in a whole new light, in a way that was relevant and meaningful and inspiring and spiritual to me, things I never knew about Judaism growing up. So here I'm about 19 years old. I'm like freshly, reinterested in Judaism. And of course, within all of that, Israel pops up in my story. And already at 19, I really wanted to go to Israel. Circumstances did not work out. And I had to wait another 3 years to go to Israel. So I graduated college. I worked for a year as a music teacher in a high school in New York City to make some money. And then I went traveling. Right after working for that year, I went to West Africa for 2 months to continue my musical studies, specifically with drums and percussion. And right from West Africa, I went to Israel for the first time, backpack on my back, 22 years old, ready to hit the Holy Land and really kind of continue this journey of exploring Judaism with no intention of becoming religious. Just want to check out what's happening in Israel, backpack around the land a little bit. I wanted to volunteer on a kibbutz a little bit. I heard so much about kibbutzim. And then come back to America and continue the rest of my life for the rest of my life. But that wasn't necessarily the plan. And literally within a week, I felt something so powerful and so unique in Israel that I never felt before. No other place, no other time. And I would just say this really quickly, because when I was in Africa, this is an important part of the story. When I was in Africa for 2 months in Ghana and in Senegal, I was writing in my journal every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. I was taking pictures galore back when we took, with film cameras. And by the end of my 2 months, I had filled up 3 journals of writings and 13 rolls of film. And I was a person who never took pictures, right? But I just wanted to capture every moment and every color and every sound and every experience, because I knew this was so unique and I might not ever come back to these places. Well, then I come to Israel, also a new place, a place I'd never been before. On some level, like the Jewish homeland, but still like a foreign culture, foreign language, a different way of life. And after feeling that very deep and personal connection in that first week, a few weeks go by after that, and I realized, wait a minute, I stopped writing in my journal and I stopped taking pictures. Like, why? I told myself, I'm in a new place, I'm in a new land, I'm with new people that I have never met before, I'm having new experiences. Why am I not documenting these experiences with my journal and with my camera the way I was doing in West Africa? And then it hit me. An idea that I learned about in college in one of my courses from one of my professors. He talked to us about a sense of place. At the time, I was an environmental studies major. By the end of my time in college, I switched to a religious studies major. But at the time, this professor talked to us about this idea of a sense of place. And he talked about how people are connected to place. Peoples are connected to place. And I didn't really understand what that meant. Coming from like the suburbs of New York, I didn't really feel connected so much to that place. And I never had that experience of feeling connected to a place until I went to Israel at the age of 22. And all of a sudden, all of these ideas and these thoughts came back to me, made sense to me for the first time in my life. And I realized the reason I'm feeling so connected to this place, this land of Israel, is because I'm a Jew and I'm part of the Jewish people, and this is our homeland. And it was a feeling I never felt before. And it was so powerful and so tangible that really opened up the door right away. I knew within those first, few moments in Israel that one day I was going to make Aliyah. I was going to spend the rest of my life in Israel. It did take 5 years for me to officially and finally make Aliyah with my wife Tamar. We got married in 2003. We made Aliyah with Nefesh B'Nefesh in 2004. And that's when I thought the Aliyah story would end. But that's really only when it began. It was like a whole nother piece of the story and journey.
Well, that's actually a really nice jumping off point, Akiva, because I want to dive into the book again, Becoming Israeli. And this is a chapter written by Eli Klein, who wrote, Aliyah experiences are like snowflakes. They appear similar, even identical from a distance. But under the microscope, it becomes clear that they are intricate and entirely unique. And I thought that was actually a rather beautiful quote. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
100%. I agree with that quote so much. And even between my wife and myself, we had and on some level still are 16 years later, having different Aliyah experiences and journeys. And it really is based on where you came from, what you were raised with. Were you raised with Israel and Zionism, or you're not? I wasn't. So that already, had an impact on my journey. Did you come with any Hebrew? Did you come with no Hebrew, like me? So I'll comment on that specifically. How
Sorry, I've known you now all this time. I didn't know that you came with klum. You came with nothing.
Klum. I mean, I between my first time going to Israel in 1998 and making Aliyah in 2004, I became religious that first time in Israel in 1998 into 1999. I found Tzfat, I fell in love with Tzfat, went to yeshiva in Tzfat, and that's where I became religious for the first time in my life when I was 22, 23. But then I came back for 5 years. And so I studied in yeshiva for 5 years. So I knew yeshiva Hebrew, but that has nothing to do with modern Hebrew, really. I mean, it definitely gives you a basis, but you can't hang out in Tel Aviv and order sandwiches in a cafe or anything like that, or talk to Israelis. This is archaic ancient Hebrew. So yeah, I came with a conversational Hebrew. I went to Ulpan twice. So I spent 10 months in intense Hebrew study, which was amazing. I loved it. It gave me a good start even after doing it twice. It wasn't enough, but then you live here and you pay your bills and you talk to people on the phone from Bezik and from the electric company, and that helps you a lot. But I would say maybe I'll just a few points of my specific Aliyah journey. One of the first things that I realized and recognized and became aware of in my own Aliyah journey was this, because I didn't grow up with Israel in my life. My wife, she came to Israel every single year of her life. It was part of her blood. For me, it wasn't like that. So even when I came to Israel in those years before making Aliyah, I never jumped into Israeli society. I hung out with my friends in Jerusalem or in Tzfat. We spoke English. I never got to know Israeli society. Didn't really travel so much around the country. And only upon making Aliyah and living in Israel was I really immersed for the first time, kind of pushed into being immersed into Israeli society. And one of the first things I started to notice is wait a minute, okay, I made Aliyah because I loved Israel. I felt connected to it, spiritual, religious reasons. But there was something happening here that I only realized upon making Aliyah. And I kind of, called it these only in Israel moments. I thought at the time I coined that phrase. Later on, I realized that somebody else coined it way before me. But I called them these only in Israel moments, things that only happen in Israel, right? Because these things can only happen in a Jewish state, in a place and at a time when the Jewish people have returned to their homeland. And I just became hyper aware of these moments, of these only in Israel moments, and just became enamored by them and in love with them and inspired by them. And it just connected me to this place even more.
In just a moment.
Just maybe a couple other kind of little.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, you go ahead.
So maybe just, okay, maybe another a couple little titles, so to speak, to chapters in my Aliyah journey. Before we move on, another one was Hebrew. Was just realizing, oh right, they speak Hebrew here, right? I got to learn some Hebrew, okay? And that was a whole journey in and of itself of learning Hebrew, of trying out Hebrew. I mean, now I'm here 16 years, I kind of forgot what it's like, but the beginning when you're trying to speak Hebrew in person, or in public with people, it's like a really frightening thing. I was 28 years old. I had 2 degrees already. I went through a master's program. Like, you feel like, like a mature adult, and then you're in Ulpan and you feel like you're back in kindergarten or first grade, and you can't even form like an understandable sentence. And you're like, what happened to me? It's very humbling and sometimes even embarrassing. So all kinds of things happened in the whole Hebrew journey. I'll just share maybe one quick little story. When we first moved into our first house upon making Aliyah, we were renting at the time, and the guy who we were renting from fortunately spoke really good English. But he told me one day, the winter's coming, it's going to get cold. I'm sending over like my handyman, and he's going to explain to you how the heating system works. It's like this very intricate heating system. I'm like, okay, so knock on the door. This guy comes in, and not only forget about English. This guy didn't speak any English. Not only did he speak Hebrew, he spoke a very special kind of Hebrew, which we call Moroccan Hebrew, right? Which has a whole nother kind of sound with the ayin and the chet and the reish, and very, very deep and guttural. And this guy took me like on a 45-minute tour of my house, showing me the intricateness of the heating system. And I was just kind of bobbing up my head like a nice Jewish American would, and at the end, when he left and I said, shalom, and my wife's like, how does the heating system work? I'm like, I have no idea. I didn't understand a word the guy just said. And like, that's how it goes at the beginning. And then like a year later, he came back to visit to like do something in the house. And I realized, wow, I'm starting to understand this guy. And that was like a nice feeling of like, a little bit of a forward movement in my Hebrew journey.
So you remained chilly for that first year, did you?
Exactly. Like, wait, does it go this way or that way?
Right. You just had to experiment there. Well, what I wanted to say just a moment ago is that in just a few minutes, we're going to go through some of your Only in Israel stories. And we certainly invite all of you that are joining us this evening to also include some of your Only in Israel stories in the chat. And we'll read some of them. And if we don't get to them, we'll be able to post them on social media, because we'd love to hear from everybody what their Only in Israel stories are. I have one in particular I think I shared with you when we had our last conversation. But there's something else that I want to highlight from the book. It's from the chapter Catching the Israel Bug by Sarah Sassoon. And I'm just going to read this just real briefly. And she wrote, "What is the Israel bug? It's quite a dangerous virus, so everyone should be warned. It takes place on an innocent holiday to Israel and manifests as a deep gut feeling that takes over one's heart and mind and urges you to miss the return El Al flight to your home country." And that's what she calls the Israel bug. And Akiva says,
yeah, so I caught that bug within the first week. Like I said before, I thought I was just going on a nice backpacking trip after college, get the traveling bug out of me. And I'll come back, around after Africa and Israel and come home and get the job and have the family and continue my life there. And that's, again, not what happened. And I caught that bug right away. And it really is this feeling of like, there's nowhere else I really want to go than Israel. I remember a friend of mine told me when I first was in Israel, they're like, now that you're connected to this place, you're going to see every time you have free time and some extra money, you're going to use that time and that money just to come back to Israel. I'm like, come on, no way. There's so many places in the world I want to go to. And that person was totally right. Yes, I've traveled some in the world, but almost every single time I had extra money or time, it was straight back to Israel for like what I looked at as like a refueling of my soul, even, to help me, kind of live another year, so to speak, in America before I came back to Israel. And maybe connected to that, I would just also add that, in this journey, once, upon making Aliyah, like that, I would say like that next chapter after like the Only in Israel hyper awareness and the Hebrew, kind of journey, that's a journey into itself, is then like the acclimating to life in Israel, kind of like settling down and realizing I'm an Israeli and like I want to learn this culture more. Like I didn't grow up with this culture, and it is new and it is different, and that kind of like glides right into the becoming Israeli, kind of chapter or kind of part of one's Aliyah journey, at least for me. And that's why I called my book Becoming Israeli, because it really is like part of the Aliyah experience. And I very specifically called it Becoming Israeli, like an ongoing action, because it doesn't finish. I think for Olim, for immigrants to Israel, it's an ongoing process, probably for the rest of your life, of constantly becoming more and more Israeli.
Because I was going to ask you, Akiva, when do you know that you've become Israeli, or will you never know? Because as you just said, it's a process.
So I think there are definitely milestones. I remember in America as a driver on the roads, I very specifically, literally never passed anybody on the road. I'm like, if this person is driving 35 miles an hour in a 60, mile an hour zone, it's for a reason. Just be patient and just stay behind him. And Israel, that all goes out the window because everyone's passing you, and sometimes people pass you and the truck in front of you and the car in front of the truck as well. And so I think there's milestones. When you pass your first car, you become more Israeli. When you pass 2 cars at a time, you become more Israeli. Yes, even when you pass 3 cars on the road at a time, you become more Israeli. When you get into your first fight, and I remember this, my first fight with an Israeli in Hebrew, that felt amazing. And that was like one of, up until that point in time at least, that was probably the best I ever spoke Hebrew up until that point, because I was like, I let my guard down and I just like let it out. I'm like, that was amazing. I spoke beautiful. I was more focused on the Hebrew than the actual argument. I'm like, this is great. I should fight with Israelis more. But all those kind of things, when you stand up for yourself more, a little bit more chutzpah, a little bit like, like asking for what you need and not being shy. But also knowing that, like, you're not offending. And this is like, we're all family here. Like, people want you to be open and honest. And they realize, there's that love. I remember one year, we were on our way to Pesach. The cars filled. We had a stoplight in Jerusalem when we lived in Jerusalem at the time. And some guy nails us from the back, into our car, like totally denting in the car. We couldn't even open up the back. And I get out of the car and I'm like, what happened? There's kids in the car. You just nailed into my car. Thank God our kids were fine. And get into like this little mini fight on the road, and we take care of all the paperwork. And at the end, we like give each other a hug and like wish each other Chag Sameach. So like those are the kind of moments where you feel like you're becoming more and more Israeli, I think.
Right. I want to ask you about the times that we're living in today, and of course the coronavirus. Do you think that there's been a particularly Israeli response to the coronavirus versus, say, for example, what you might have seen is responses in other countries? And I don't necessarily mean from a government level, but I mean just from a people level, from an Israeli population perspective.
I really do. I've been thinking about this a lot, I have to say, over the past few months. And look, I know, like, what we experience in the world, especially of other places and other countries, is very, framed by media and social media, of course. So there is that bias or that, created vantage point for us. But based on what I can glean and understand and compared to my own experience here, I really feel, especially in the first wave, now we're in the second wave, unfortunately, and then things are a lot worse. But especially in the first wave, I was so proud of Israel. I felt we had such an Israeli reach where everyone like knew in a serious situation. And yeah, you have to like stop your everyday kind of routine to take care of business. And, somebody wrote an article about it, an op-ed. It might have been Michael Oren. I don't remember, but it was this beautiful piece I totally related to, totally agreed with, that, Israelis know how to deal with stressful situations, with times of distress and even chaos, with wars and intifadas and all these rockets falling. And we as a society have learned over the years how to, balance the individual needs and rights, so to speak, with the collective needs things that have to be done for the greater society. And Israel I feel like got right into it and did what we needed to do. I still feel that that's happening in the second wave, even though what I see in the media and the social media doesn't really talk about that. So much talking about how Israel's like dropping the ball and messing up and things are horrible here. It is the second wave. People knew this for months already, that the second wave was going to be much, much worse. And that is what we're seeing. The numbers are much, much higher. But I still see on the ground here, even in the second wave, I have to say, I say this to my wife all the time, I'm so proud of what I see in Israel. Everywhere I go, whether it's like the supermarket or like a bunch of stores, wherever people are wearing masks all the time. You won't walk into a store with people not wearing masks. You won't walk around like the center of a town without seeing masks on everybody. I really feel like people understand it. It's like it's an intense time. Yeah, it's a stressful time, but it's like what we need to do to get through it collectively. It's not perfect, obviously. It's we're still like people, human beings with our mistakes that we made. But I do really feel that that there is an Israeli response to this, as opposed to what I can say, if I can say, like what I see at least from my vantage point here in America, has become very political. Like you wear a mask because you vote this way. You don't wear a mask because you vote that way. You don't see that in Israel at all. And even though of course we still have our disunity on issues here, I do feel on some level, of course it's not perfect, it's not 100%, but there is a collective response to this.
And before we get back to the book, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about Israel's newly established relations with both the UAE and Bahrain. And I'm just wondering what the feeling was on the street there.
So, I had my experience, and I was really curious if other people's experiences were similar to mine. So I actually checked in with people, and it seems like a lot of people had similar experiences to mine, which is, at first, it was like, where'd that come from? Like out of the blue, out of nowhere, like we're making peace with this country that we never were really at war with anyway, let's be honest. Okay, we never had a peace deal with them, but like whoever heard of the conflict between Israel and the UAE? So that was kind of like a first phase response. And then the second phase was like, okay, that's cool. Another, country add to the list that we have peace with. That's really nice. Like, can't hurt. And then like the next phase sunk in very quickly. This all happened very, very quickly, especially after the actual peace signing. Like, wait a minute, like something's happening here. This is actually big. When Saudi Arabia allowed the Israeli plane to fly over its airspace, that was huge. And I and other people I know started to realize, wait a minute, this could actually be that door opening to a new Middle East. And that's what it feels right now. There's a real sense of excitement, besides the fact that people can travel to new places, which is also nice, let's be honest. But there's a feeling of a potential new Middle East, a warm Middle East, even warmer than, the peace that we had with Egypt at the end of the 70s and with Jordan in the 90s. That's nice to have. Of course, no war is great, especially with Egypt, but it's never been like a warm peace. It's never been a real sharing or traveling between the two. And this feels really different and really exciting. And again, someone wrote an article on this, we're in this generation, we don't know what it's like to have a peace signing. And that just feels really exciting that it's happening in our time.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, listen, I want to dive back into the book. And there's a whole section that you have at the end called Only in Israel. We mentioned it just a moment ago. And I want to just tick off a couple that I have here. As I said, I have the whole book all marked up, as you can see, Akiva. And I've got all these kind of post-it notes here. So I love the book. I really do. I think it's brilliant. And there were a couple that I wanted to tick off, some that I wanted for you to share. But the one that I had here was, and just one of many actually, only in Israel, or on the bus that has a sticker that says, "This bus has already been cleaned for Pesach. Please keep it clean." Right? That one I loved. And then the other one, only in Israel, the woman who hands you her child to hold in line at the grocery store because she forgot to pick up the toilet paper. Talk about during coronavirus times. Or only in Israel, how about the Arab and Jewish men praying their afternoon prayers just meters from one another in the park? Once again, only in Israel. You had three sections here. One is religious life, and then the other was living in the Middle East, again, in the only Israel section. And then you had a humorous section, and I think you had another section here. Yeah, security. And there was one that I really particularly loved, well, many that I actually loved, about someone's name. Do you know who I'm talking about? Ben,
I think so.
So-and-so, Ben, so-and-so. Can you relay that? I don't want to give it away. I'd rather you tell it.
Yeah, that's a great. Actually, that's so funny because that's the page that I happen to be open to.
You know which one I'm talking about?
So, don't tell me if it's the one, but I'll just say before I even read it, just like what the examples that you shared, I love, and it just like it sounds so funny to say. It's like, of course, but it's like such a Jewish state. And I don't mean like Jewish in like the typical religious sense, in just like the family sense and the cultural sense and the we're all here together sense. I can fight with you 1 second and give you a hug the second moment, and I can give you my kid online, and I can trust you. I literally, I mean, there's just a sense of warmth and a sense of family here that it's really, it's powerful and it's beautiful. So I think the story that you're referring to is this on page 216. So this one wasn't my personal experience, but I collected this from somebody else. So the person writes, I met a cab driver named Mashiach, right? So the person says, is your name actually Mashiach, or is that a nickname? The driver says, no, that's my actual name. So the person asks, why did your parents give you that name? And the driver answers, because her family name is Ben David. Mashiach Ben David.
Love that one. That was a laugh out loud moment for me when I read that. Can you talk about carrying the Torah and what happened? I guess it was to you carrying the Torah down the street, right?
So yeah, and this really just like also opens up a window into like religious, secular. I feel like in Israel, one of the most beautiful aspects I believe of Israel is that, yeah, people talk about the divide between the religious and the secular, but when you live here on the ground, on the streets, yeah, like they're religious and they're secular, but the divide is so much weaker and so much lower than I think it's made out to be. And there's such like a love of tradition and openness to tradition, right? And the labels start to fade away more and more of these. So if I'm remembering, or if I'm referring to the right story, which I think I am, this one goes, I was taking the Torah back after Shabbat morning prayers to where I could lock it up, and was walking up a narrow road when a car came toward me slowly. Remember, this is Shabbat, so someone's driving their car in Shabbat, right? When the car got to me, it slowed almost to a halt. The back window came down, and the man in the back seat reached out, kissed the Torah, and wished me Shabbat Shalom. Only in Israel.
Only in Israel. I love that. I absolutely love
Only
that. There was one that I really like, which is also a secular one, and it's on page 224. If you don't mind opening it, it has to do with borrowing a cell phone. Can you share that one? Because I thought that was hysterical.
Oh yeah.
It's real.
Totally,
it's real chutzpah. It's real chutzpah, isn't it?
I'm going to read this one, and I'm going to give you another chutzpah one. All right.
Please.
Only in Israel does a woman ask you if she can borrow your phone quickly, of course, while you're using it. You give it to her, and she continues to have a 10-minute conversation on it. When you tell her your bus is coming and you need your phone back, she tells you, it's okay, I'm taking the same bus.
So
that reminds me, actually, check this one out.
Yeah.
Check this one out. I'm not sure if I put this in the book, I might have, but check this one out. This one happened to me. I was on a bus, a packed bus. Some guy gets on the bus, like this tall, young Israeli guy with like long hair, and he's just like Mr. Happy, Mr. Smiley. And he sits like right in front of me. And I take out my water bottle to take a drink, and he turns around and he asks me in Hebrew, he's like, hey man, can I have a sip? So first of all, like my first answer, like, no, like remembering my cleanliness, hygienic self. Of course you can't have a sip from my bottle. And this is even years before Corona. But I'm like, okay, come on. Like, he's like a nice guy. Of course he's not going to put his lips on it. Just give the guy some water. He's thirsty. So I hand him my bottle. What does he do? He puts his lips right on the bottle, takes a big old sip of it, and then hands it back to me with a big smile on his face. Thanks, Achi. Thanks, my brother. Only in Israel.
Only in Israel, absolutely. Well, tons of other only in Israel stories, and I'm just really mindful of the clock. We have just a couple minutes left, but certainly if anyone has his or her own only in Israel story that you'd like to share, please put it in the chat. I just want to share one of mine briefly, and I think I might have mentioned it to you when we did our interview. In 2005, I was in Israel. And it was May and June, and I was flying back to the United States, and I called United Airlines, and I didn't want to fly on Shavuot. So I asked the rep at United Airlines, when is Shavuot? And she told me. And the thought bubble in my head was, had I called United Airlines here in the United States and asked, when is Shavuot? Only in Israel, right? That they're going to know about that. I do want to say, though, I'm going to reach over here because our next guest actually I'm going to check the date, on October 28th is your friend, Alex Rivchin, who we've had on Israel Cast. He just wrote a book. It's this one. It's Zionism, the Concise History. As you can see, I read it and I already have my notes for him. He actually contributed a chapter to your book, Becoming Israeli. And one of the things that I thought was actually very poignant and very beautiful in many ways about what Alex said about becoming Israeli is that he was tired of sighing. In other words, he always had a sigh whenever anyone asked him, where are you from? And it was always going to be a backstory. I'm from the Ukraine, and then I was from Australia. Now I'm here. And once you're from Israel, you're kind of always from Israel, right? And I'm just wondering if you can talk about that feeling and that sensation. And can you kind of dovetail that, Akiva, into the amount of people that are making Aliyah now versus when you were making Aliyah?
100%. So I'd say, first of all, I totally agree with Alex's comment. And I feel like, I'll speak for myself, but I know a lot of other people feel this as well. And even people who don't make Aliyah, I know they feel this also, that when you come here, you feel a sense of home. You feel like, wow, like I feel not only a sense of connection because of the history and the culture and, wow, we've returned to our land after 2,000 years and that's just so inspiring. But I feel connected. I feel personally at home. I feel grounded. I feel myself. And that's something I've been thinking about more and more as my own time goes on here in Israel, that not only have I become Israeli or am I becoming Israeli, I feel like by becoming Israeli, I'm becoming more and more myself. And that knowing of who I am and feeling really grounded and centered in who I am. And it's a whole other conversation. It's a whole other book even maybe. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot. And I'll just say a quick sentence on it. But this idea that Israeli society and culture, I can speak for myself, has had such a positive impact on who I am today and who I have become. And I know I would not have become the same person had I not lived in Israel all these years. And relating it to the second part of your question, I think, look, the world is shaking up. Things are becoming unsettled, especially in America with Corona and with Black Lives Matter and racism issues and so many other issues. It's a really very unique and interesting time and a trying time and a challenging time. But we also know that challenging times open up new opportunities. And I think a lot of American Jews are feeling that and sensing that and kind of, even channeling that. If they were on the fence about Aliyah before, now they're already jumping into the decision to make Aliyah. If maybe they weren't even thinking about it before, they're jumping onto the fence and considering it, because these are turbulent times already. And I think people are seeing, that Israel could really offer them so many things that they value about life and living that maybe they just didn't consider before these turbulent times really hit us.
Right. Listen, Akiva, vegan rabbi, Akiva. When did you become, just real quickly, when did you become vegan? How long have you been vegan?
So I became vegan 25 years ago.
Yeah, it's been a long time for you.
It's been a long time, longer than I've not been vegan at this point. I was 19, now I'm 44. So became vegan before I became religious and before I became Zionist and all those other things. But when I became connected to Judaism, what I was learning about in Judaism only strengthened my commitment and my passion for food ethics and compassion towards animals, which Judaism is filled with, and my lifestyle of being vegan. And eventually I became a rabbi. I got rabbinic ordination. And, while I taught Jewish history and Israel studies for the past 13 years at Alexander Muss High School in Israel, always on the side, I was always involved with Jewish environmental education as well. And food ethics and veganism was always a big thing that I enjoyed teaching about. And just recently set up a new Facebook page called Vegan Rabbi, which is just like a nice place for me to share a lot of these Jewish food ethics, vegan, compassion for animals kind of teachings. And it's been getting a nice response so far. So.
Well, I took the plunge 2 years ago, so I'm a regular viewer of your Facebook page. Listen, this was so fantastic, and we just want to truly thank you for joining us here for our inaugural fall session of our book club, our JNF book club. Once again, I can't recommend the book enough. It's called Becoming Israeli. And for all of you that are in the group, if you've read it, I think you're going to know what I'm talking about by my saying how much I loved it. And if you haven't read it yet, I really urge you to get a copy, because there's some great chapters, just some very well-written chapters, which really capture the essence of what it is to be Israeli, and also Akiva's perspectives as well. So really, thank you so much for writing that book, Akiva. And again, on October 28th, and we hope you're going to wake up in the middle of the night again, Akiva, and join us to hear your friend Alex Rivchin, who's going to be joining us. And then we are super excited because on November 18th, we have the one and only Jo Nathan, who's going to be talking to us about her seminal book called The Foods of Israel Today. So we're very, very excited about that. And we just want to truly thank you, Akiva, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again. And thanks so much to everybody for joining us. And I see that Jay Epstein has written in the chat. And Jay, we're going to hopefully put that, I only just saw it, and we're going to put that hopefully somewhere on social media. So we do want to thank you for weighing in there. And now we're going to hand it over to Sarah. And we hope you get some sleep, Akiva.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's really a pleasure and once again an honor to talk to you again. And thank you, Sarah, and everybody else for organizing this great event. Great to take part.
Take it easy and Shanav Tova.
Shana tova
Thank
likulam.
you everyone for joining tonight. Stephen has done quite a close, so I will keep it brief. He plugged us for the next book club as well. But I just would really love to, again, thank everyone for coming tonight. And if you enjoyed tonight's programming, if you could please consider donating to Jewish National Fund as we join a beautiful future for the land of Israel. Thank you all for joining.